Firstly, I'd like to thank you for allowing us to come here today for this interview, and perhaps to just give you a little bit of information about the house, the Dylan Thomas birthplace, which my wife and I restored and opened to the public in 2008. It was opened by Dylan's daughter, Rowan. And in the intervening period, we've talked to a lot of people who knew Dylan or were influenced by Dylan, including a maid, Emily, who worked for the Thomases for 5 years when she was 15 and Dylan was 16. And President Jimmy Carter was another person we interviewed. So we've got a range of people, and we're looking to do 100 people for Dylan's 100th birthday anniversary, which is in 2014. Perhaps I could first ask you about your early life in Swansea. I believe that you were born in Uster and then moved to Mumbles.
Born in Uster. We spent a few years in Cardiff as well, and then back to Swansea when I was 11. And I started then in the other school in Swansea, in Duneva.
When was it that you became first aware of the work of Dylan Thomas?
I suppose it was in my early teens when a cousin of mine gave me a copy of Under Milk Wood to read. And I didn't really get the full flavour of it at that time, but I knew there was something remarkable going on there. And then in school, of course, we did some of his poems for criticism exercises in English, and I was taught English by somebody who'd actually been at school with Dylan, the grammar school, John Bennett, who himself was a poet in a small way. So he had an enthusiasm, he encouraged that. And in the sixth form, when I was beginning to get ready for sitting my entrance examinations for Cambridge, he encouraged me to do a long piece of writing about Dylan's poetry. So I spent several months reading around, reading the poetry, reading commentaries on the poetry, and writing a long essay on it.
Was it Dylan's work that inspired you to start writing poetry?
I think all of us who were interested in English and literary things at school in Swansea in that generation sort of fancied ourselves as the Dylan Thomas of the next generation. We all tried our hand at poetry. And I think most of us, certainly looking back, I would say this, were very much influenced by the superficial style and tried to copy it. But it's quite difficult to copy successfully, actually. Dylan's technique looks easier than it is because there's such fluency, such a kind of rolling in of the tide with his poetry that you think it comes easily. Actually, it doesn't. And you look at his notes, you look at his notebooks, and you realize how very hard he worked to get those results. One of the things about him is that he had an exceptional ear, a real musical ear. So you can see him working to get the cadence, the rhythm of a line right, getting the vowels in the right order, getting the right sequence of sounds in a line. And that is the mark of a real professional, I think, in poetry.
Dylan's early published work was in the Swansea Grammar School magazine. I know that you've said that your early work was in the Duneva School magazine, and you hope that all those copies have been destroyed. Well, I know that a lot of the Swansea Grammar School magazines still exist. Dylan's early work in the Swansea Grammar School magazine was very much of an adolescent nature, yet by the age of 15 and going on till 19 or 20, he produced some of the most enduring poetry of the 20th century. Have you any idea, as a poet yourself, how that might have come about?
It is really extraordinary that by the time he's 20, Dylan has produced a sort of corpus of work which is the equivalent of quite a lot of mature poets' best work. It's partly to do with the polish, the sheer effort that goes into them, the sounds, the work on those vowel sounds, the music of the lines. And you can see how very early he got that technique off to a fine art. He said, I think at one point, that God moved in a series of long vowels for him. But also he's somebody who's really hungry for experience and who's, both in prose and poetry, all the time digesting, processing what's happening to him. So it's not surprising that some of the most memorable work comes from his reflection on childhood and adolescence.
Do you have a favourite Dylan Thomas poem?
It's difficult, to be honest. most of my real favourites are a little bit later. Vision and Prayer, I think, is an extraordinary achievement. But I'm also deeply fond of the very late ones, Fernhill and... Yes, that last phase of very gentle, very visionary poetry. In the very early poems, he's flexing his muscles. He's working out what he can do. So a lot of them are exercises in very, very compressed, very tight, very complicated patterns, pattern making. And some of them barely make sense because you can see he's playing with words. And I remember reading a commentary on one of the earlier poems, I think it's No Say Nay, and the commentator was trying his very best. And I realized after about half an hour of reading this, you're not meant to make sense of this, really. He's playing around, and that's fine. But don't take it too seriously. People forget, I think, that artists become great artists by playing around, by discovering what they can do, and not always by being great and serious and solemn, but just, yes, trying it out.
Perhaps we could touch a moment on Dylan's religious beliefs. You mentioned God and long vowels. Dylan's religious background is complex. He went to chapel in Newton. His father was allegedly an atheist. Do you see that coming through in Dylan's poetry?
Yes, I think his relationship with religion is a very, very convoluted affair. He was deeply impatient of the chapel piety of his boyhood, and he could write very cruelly, very scathingly about that. He admired Craddock Evans's work, and that tells its own story, his relentless satire of chapel life. At the same time, he's got a spirituality, and his poem, This Bread I Break, which is quite an early one, is in its way a very powerful meditation on the Holy Communion, on the Mass. And when I was a boy, I remember reading in Irene Talvin Davis's book, Dylan, Druid of the Broken Body, which argues very strongly that you've got to read him as a Christian poet. I think that's pushing it. I mean, the figure of Christ appears often as a kind of disguise for the poet himself, a disguise for ways of talking about humanity in general. And whatever's going on, it's not a conventional churchy religion. But something like Vision and Prayer, I think that's one of the great religious poems in its way. And the Refusal to Mourn the Death by Fire also ends with a kind of secular Gloria. So there's something going on. And those people who remembered him late in life, sitting quietly at the back of the church in Larne during the early morning mass on Sundays occasionally, that tells a bit of a story. He's not a secular poet, he's not a godless poet, but he's somebody who can't quite leave the religious themes alone.
We can't really do an interview about Dylan without mentioning the other poet from Swansea, the rather unsung hero, Vernon Watkins. How do you see his influence on the work of Dylan?
Well, Vernon Watkins is, in some ways, the antithesis of Dylan as a person and as a poet. As a person, he has this bank clerk who leads a blameless domestic life in Gower. As a poet, someone who's immensely rich and complex mythological framework of his writing, but all very, very strictly in a slightly Victorian idiom in some ways, so that people miss the depth of it. I think Watkins has almost as much of an ear at his best as Dylan has. So in the Ballad of the Mari Lloyd, the song-like quality, the close attention to sounds and how they work, the way in which you can shift the vowels or consonants of a phrase just a little bit to make a big change, it's very, very skillful.
Vernon took his influence from the landscape, and in particular the landscape around his home in Pennard. You as a poet, do you take your inspiration from the places you visit, or does it come to you naturally?
Well, certainly when I began writing, it was a rather indoor affair, but it's got less so over the years. I find landscape does stir things very deeply in me. There's a whole bundle of poems that have their origin in my first visit to the Holy Land, and some others that came from Africa. But West Wales is still somewhere that prompts me to write.
When President Jimmy Carter visited on a presidential visit to London in 1997, he rather controversially went to Westminster Abbey and asked where the memorial to Dylan was, and they told him that they didn't have people like that there, alluding perhaps to his reputation as a womanizer and as a drunkard. Dylan was a rock star celebrity of his day. Today, he would be the darling of the tabloid newspapers. Do you think that image has affected Dylan's celebrity status or his the way that he is perceived by the general public?
I think it does. I think there's a problem, in a sense, with Dylan's legend. Here is somebody living up to the stereotype of a poet. He drinks a lot, he has a lot of women, he borrows money and doesn't repay it, he lives a thoroughly bohemian, irresponsible life, all the rest of it. And people think, oh yes, that's what artists are like, and they don't bother about what the real art is. Kingsley Amis, who didn't like him at all, of course, has this character in Lucky Jim, who wants to be an artist and thinks he's an artist because he drinks and womanizes a lot. And that gives him the right to behave like an artist, but he's actually no good at art. Now, that's not true of Dylan, obviously, but sometimes you just have to forget the biography and look at what's on the page.
And finally, the centenary of Dylan's birth is in 2014. Is there any way that you feel that it should be celebrated in a way that is most appropriate?
Well, I think the best way of celebrating is to encourage young writers. And I hope whatever's done for the centenary, there'll be some really lasting memorial in terms of something that will help encourage young people in writing poetry and prose. I think young people are almost always very eager, given the chance to write. To encourage that, to help it get better, to polish it, and that may mean prizes for, why not, for young people in Swansea writing poetry and prose, the chance of perhaps spending some time with a senior writer, a poet, checking out their work, finding out what it's like to write, that sort of thing. I think that's the best memorial we could give him. Over Sir John's hill, the hawk on fire hangs still. In a hoisted cloud at drop of dusk, he pulls to his claws and gallows up the rays of his eyes the small birds of the bay, and the shrill child's play, wars of the sparrows and such, who swansing dusk in wrangling hedges, and blithely they squawk to fiery Tyburn over the wrestle of elms, until the flashed, the noosed hawk crashes, and slowly the fishing, holy stalking heron in the river Towie below bows his tilted headstone. Flash, and the plumes crack, and a black cap of jackdaws Sir John's just hill dons, and again the gulled birds, hair to the hawk on fire, the halter height over Towie's fins in a whack of wind. There, where the elegiac fisher bird stabs and paddles in the pebbly, dab-filled shallow and sedge, and dilly-dilly calls the loft hawk, come and be killed. I open the leaves of the water at a passage of psalms and shadows among the pincéd sand crabs prancing, and read in a shell death, clear as a boy's bell. All praise of the hawk on fire in hawk-eyed dusk be sung when his viperish fuse hangs looped with flames under the brand wing, and blessed shall young green chickens of the bay and bushes cluck, dilly-dilly, come, let us die. We grieve as the blithe birds never again leave shingle and elm, the heron and I, young Aesop, fabling to the near night by the dingle of eels, Saint Heron hymning in the shell-hung, distant, crystal harbour vale, where the sea cobbles sail, and wharves of water, where the walls dance and the white cranes stilt. It is the heron and I under judging Sir John's elmed hill, telltale the knelled guilt of the led-astray birds, whom God, for their breast of whistles, have mercy on, God in his whirlwind silence save, who marks the sparrow's hail for their soul's song. Now the heron grieves in the weeded verge. Through windows of dusk and water I see the tilting, whispering heron mirrored go, as the snapped feathers snow, fishing in the tear of the Towie. Only a hoot owl hollows, a grass blade blown in cupped hands, in the looted elms, and no green cocks or hens shout now on Sir John's Hill. The heron, ankling the scaly lowlands of the waves, makes all the music, and I who hear the tune of the slow were-willow river, grave before the lunge of the night, the notes on this time-shaken stone, for the sake of the souls of the slain birds sailing.